mean, there's only one question to really ask, isn't there? Do you believe in the power of Hulkamania, or are you going crazy on the macho madness? So, I had a bit of a first the other day. My boss, who I very much enjoy, I guess plug here for Haunted Savannah, which is one of the oldest tour groups here in Savannah. We do haunted tours, true crime tours, pub crawls. It's a ton of fun. People really enjoy it. We get great reviews. Well, my boss has asked if I could do a video for him because he found my TikTok channel and enjoys the videos I make. I know. I didn't believe it either when I found out. I don't even enjoy the videos I make. But what he was interested in was me possibly making reviews of figures he had as a kid. Unfortunately, I didn't have any real Ghostbusters, but I did have some of my old rubber wrestlers, my LJNs, and he specifically said he had a Hulk Hogan and a Macho Man. Well, lucky for you, buddy, or sir, boss man, whatever. I have Hulk Hogan and Macho Man. So for anyone who might be unaware, this is the original WWF toy line. The first toy line to feature wrestlers from the World Wrestling Federation, now of course WWE, was LJN, the same company that made all those shitty video games that the angry video game nerd constantly cries about. Thing is, right, these LJN figures are pretty divisive. A lot of people look at these and say, oh, they're dog toys, oh, they don't move, but here's what I'm going to say, right? Listen to me, just hear me out. These guys came out in the 80s. You know, and sure, you had lines like G.I. Joe, you had lines like the real Ghostbusters, a lot of good stuff coming out of Kenner. Thing is, a lot of those figures had a lot of reuse, and a lot of them didn't have, a lot of those figures had a lot of reuse, and a lot of them didn't really look like the characters that they were supposed to be, you know? Likeness wasn't really a thing. You buy an LJN figure, though, it's 100% unique because it's rubber. You can't reuse it for anything else without completely changing parts of it. And there's the fact that their likenesses were really on point for the time. It's crazy to think, but there was a time where these could have been considered some of the most accurate toys ever made. Just think about that for a sec. Now, me, personally, when I think of a vintage wrestling toy line that I want to collect, I tend to go more for Hasbro's. I just think they're a little bit more charming and I like them more. But these guys are still spectacular, and my very small LJN collection is one of the collections I cherish the most just because of how unique they are, not just in my wrestling shelves, but just all my shelves in general. It's a line that I actually kind of want to get more invested into, especially now that I'm getting closer to completing my Hasbro's. But without further ado, let's actually talk about the Mega Powers here. Hogan was released in Wave 1 because, of course he was. He was the main character of the WWF, especially at that time, so it makes sense. Looking at the figure in general, I really enjoy just all the things I captured. I think the tan's definitely there, right? I still think it's a little too light. I kind of wish that they had maybe given him a little bit more of a bronze complexion. But I think that they did an admirable job, more admirable than a lot of modern toy companies do when it comes to the tan. As for the sculpting of the figure, you can see like they got the likeness of the face like actually pretty well. I think the eyes might be slightly too big, but that's a decent Hogan. The headband does have a little bit of paint wear, as does his eyebrows, and that's where we get to one of the big issues with these figures over time. They're rubber, so the paint does wear off. You can see I have a lot of wear up here in the hair, but I always like to think that that's just because he's balding. You have paint wear on the headband, a little bit of the eyebrows, on the wrist wraps. You have paint scuffing here on the trunks, but thankfully nothing is missing, but the knee pads have been lost. So, I've seen a lot of Hogans that I never bought, and the reason was, the paint would be missing specifically from right here, and I can't explain to you why. But for some reason, the idea of a dickless Hogan actually took me more out of it than getting a figure who had some face, like, pieces of his face missing. I don't know what that says about my psychology, but, like, yeah, that was my literal logic there. But after all said and done, my only real complaint with this figure is he can't stand. Like, if I zoom out, right, you can see he's at an unbelievably awkward angle. And this is just a reality of a lot of the LJNs. where they just don't really have the ability to stand straight up. They did actually make figure stands, but only for Wave 1, and they are incredibly expensive now. Your best bet is to get like a doll display, like a doll stand, and you can do it that way. Me, I kind of just lean them against the back of the shelf. That's what I do. But you can see if I let go, yeah. And there's no amount of finagling you can do because there's no articulation. This is just what Hogan is. All the times he was standing up before, it was basically just on the support of Macho, which, speaking of which, why don't we talk about the dude who carried Hogan for at least a couple years there. Out of all my LJNs, I have a handful that can stand up. Macho and King Kong Bundy. Those are the two. Personally, Bundy is my favorite LJN figure. But my first LJN, and my second favorite now, is this Macho. It's the First Macho Man Toy, which makes it incredibly special. It's WrestleMania 2, WrestleMania 3 era Randy, where you had the headband and the purple trunks. It's just perfect. Like, it helps that Macho is like the first wrestler I fell in love with, and like to this day is one of my absolute favorites of all time. But there's something about this figure, man, that it tells you who Macho is. Like, the proportions are on point. I love his general, like, pose. I like his trunks. Now, the only, like, major paint fading I have is that his star is kind of being up there. But, hey, that's fine. That's from where he was, like, hiding stuff in his trunks, like he did in WrestleMania 2. A little bit of paint scuff down there on the knee pad as well. Other than that, like, aside from this weird third nipple and some discoloration from yellowing over time, this guy was probably in the sun for a bit, this Macho still really holds up. And I've seen people, specifically with this Macho, complain like, oh, what are you supposed to do with him? Use your friggin' imagination, that's what. Like, I could see Macho coming in and it's like, ooh, elbow drop. Ooh, elbow drop. Ooh, backflip. Ow, he didn't backflip, he's too big. He's too big. Steroids make it to where you can't backflip. But here's the thing, right? I actually already did a Macho review. I did a while back, and it was one of my favorite reviews when it came out. But it's old enough now to where it's like in a format I no longer use, and I don't want to post on YouTube. Plus, this was a request for someone who I really respect and enjoy talking to. And also, like, it made talking about Hogan easier because, hey, Macho's now a tripod. Looking at these two, I'd even argue they're in decently good proportion. Like, Hogan is squat, so where he's standing up, he'd be a little bit taller than Macho, which would be correct. Also, he looks a little bit like... I'm gonna say he looks a little bit, like, less defined, but more muscular than Macho, just overall, which also would be correct. But overall, I think these two really are just spectacular figures, especially if you're into, like, the history of wrestling, or the history of figures, or even the history of wrestling figures. Moreover, I think there's a good reason to say that either one of them is the best out of this two. I think Randy is a better figure. I think Macho just looks better, has more usability, probably has a better pose. But Hogan, like, this is one of the most iconic toys of all time. There's been so many movies and shows where this figure has shown up. It's a figure where, legitimately, most people who aren't even into wrestling at least know that Hulk Hogan figure. So even if I don't like them as much as my Hasbros, or even as much as some of my other, figures of this style, I think these two really are spectacular, and they bring a shelf together. Plus, LJN as a whole has a legacy. After these guys, Galoob, and also original San Francisco toy makers did rubber figures for WCW, and all those guys are really cool. I actually really want to, build up my Galoob collection. And then, of course, Jax had LJN-inspired figures in their Classic Superstars line. And right now, right this second, AEW is doing rubber figures also inspired by the LJNs. So these guys have left a lasting impact. And for all those reasons, as well as just the fact that they're good toys, I say they're amazing.